Good morning, everyone. We're just waiting a few moments while participants file in from the waiting room into this morning's session. So if you'll just bear with us a few more minutes, we'll wait a little bit so that people can make their way from the waiting room into our session. And again, we're just waiting a moment for people to file in from the Zoom waiting room into our webinar. So if you'll just bear with us for another moment or two, we'll get started shortly. Well, I think as people are filing in, I'll go ahead and get us started. I'm Bill Maurer. I'm the Dean of Social Sciences at UC Irvine. And thank you all for being here for this session on refusing austerity in higher education, which we're billing as a how-to. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that UC Irvine and our co-sponsor today, UCLA, are within the ancestral and unceded shared territories of the Achaman, Tongva, and Gabrielino peoples. As members of a giant land-grant institution, we acknowledge the Achaman, Tongva, and Gabrielino as the traditional land caretakers whose efforts to steward and protect the land continue today. And now I'd just like to begin with this slide from my colleague Marty Wattenberg's elections class syllabus. This is at the top of his syllabus in his class on elections. And he says, right there on the syllabus, you might call this class Democracy 101, where you'll learn that the situation pictured above is not inevitable, but rather the result of political choices dependent on who exercises political power. Now, I'm both the Dean of the School of Social Sciences at Irvine, a large academic unit with around 7,000 undergraduate majors, 450 PhD students, 180 or so faculty and 80 staff, plus a number of adjuncts. And I'm an anthropologist who writes on money. But I write on money not the way an economist might, but rather I write on money as a sort of political project. That is, money is about claims on others and the authorization of rights and remedies associated with those claims on others. So as we begin to grapple with the ongoing pandemic and its economic consequences, we need to be careful not to accept the inevitability of budgets or budgeting decisions, and instead center our arguments on who is making what claims on whom, or on whose labor and resources. How are existing resources being redeployed and why, and based on what values? And how can political will create new resources to meet new claims? I also want to set the stage today by reflecting on how our current predicament is so different from the global financial crisis or Great Recession to which many have been comparing it. First, in California anyway, there's different political leadership and different political will in the state. New tools at the disposal of the state, both the state's reserves and various federal and state relief measures, as well as a seeming commitment, at least right now, to really spend some money to help get over the hump. And at the same time, compared to the GFC, this crisis is decidedly hitting the bottom of the income distribution in a much more focused way and much harder than others, which skews the political and fiscal response in various ways we can't yet predict. So I guess I see a brewing battle between the forces of austerity and the forces of relief in a way that simply didn't exist during the global financial crisis. And in the UC, which we'll be talking about a lot today, but not exclusively, we will be talking about higher ed in general. Within the UC system, there are striking differences among the campuses right now. My own campus, UC Irvine, entered this in a very good financial situation. And we're doing things like taking savings that have been associated with the pandemic, like money that would have been spent on travel of people coming to campus to give conference presentations or whatever, and putting it toward other uses like graduate support. In my own school, we've hired about 40 more TAs in the spring than we would have otherwise to provide additional instructional support for the transition to remote teaching, and we're probably going to do the same in the fall. We're renewing our lecturers, and we're doing everything we can to hire more undergraduate work studies, graduate research assistants, TAs, a ton more. We've also just added a whole bunch more summer session classes, which will also employ more graduate students. And while there's a partial staff hiring freeze, the provost here intends to allow some faculty recruiting to continue next year. So again, it's very different on each campus. Other campuses didn't enter this in as good a financial standing. And that's probably the case for many other institutions around the country that are starting to cut and that are getting into the supposedly inevitable logic of austerity, which we'll be deconstructing a bit today. So I just want to acknowledge first that we acknowledge this variegated landscape in higher ed. And again, to return to where I began, there's a new set of political discourses and tools out there that have gained currency, from universal basic income to the Fed's municipal lending facility, and the Jerome Powell, chairman of the Fed board, pleading with Congress to spend his money that he's creating. I'm here today in part because I think we need to learn not just what some of these new tools are, but how we can operationalize them, put them in practice in higher ed to make these political claims on money so that our budgets reflect our values and not the supposed inevitability of austerity. With that, I'm going to turn it over to my co-host, Professor Hannah Appel at UCLA. Hannah, take it over.
Thanks so much, Dean Maurer. As Bill said, my name is Hannah Appel, and I teach in anthropology and global studies at UCLA, where I'm also the associate director of the Luskin Institute on Inequality and Democracy, one of the co-hosts of this event. I am also, significant to our purposes today, a student debtor. My household owes over $70,000 in student debt, and I am a co-founder of the Debt Collective, an activist group that organizes debtors' unions. So I'm just going to give a couple more framing remarks, and then I'm going to introduce our fabulous panelists and get us started. So we're here, as Dean Maurer said, because we do not accept the inevitability of budgets or budgeting decisions. We are here to think together about how to continue to refuse austerity in higher education. We are here to ask, where are the existing resources? Where are the potential resources? How do we redistribute resources from within the university, spending down endowments, cutting exorbitant administrative salaries, reallocating travel line items, as Dean Maurer is talking about, ending militarized policing contracts? And how do we demand resources from outside the university, state funds, wealth taxes, renegotiating university bond obligations, and the radically expanding possibilities of the federal funding in this moment, as Bill gestured to, basic income, job guarantees, the MLF, right, the Municipal Liquidity Facility. But of course, identifying these resources is only part of our task. The harder part, arguably, is to ask, how can we organize the political will? What tactics and strategies can we use to distribute these resources equitably, reparatively? How can we ensure that all people, but especially the most precarious, the lowest paid, the intersectionally marginalized in higher ed, remain employed, fed, housed, educated, and well, now and into the future? As we enact that future, how do we fight for both free school and freedom school, to paraphrase the Undercommons Collective from UCLA? So we are, of course, already refusing austerity from the UC system to the CUNY system and everywhere in between. We have seen wildcat strikes and rent strikes, student debt strikes and tuition refusal, sickouts and petitions, digital pickets and bold manifestos. At Ohio State, with drastic cuts to African American studies and women's gender and sexuality studies, we've seen a faculty-led, open source alternative budget project go online. Across the country, many of you, groups of workers and students and faculty, have been meeting and organizing online, from the Labor Notes Collective to University Workers United for a Fair Future to the UC-wide COLA Coalition. And we've seen some wins, right? So UCAFT, the union representing librarians and non-Senate faculty working throughout the UC system, organized and won an end to the UC Berkeley hiring freeze for lecturers. And yet, just to the south at UC Santa Cruz, roughly 80 academic student employees were either fired from their spring teaching appointments or deemed ineligible. And this was their punishment for participating in a wildcat strike demanding a cost of living adjustment in response to austerity that long preceded COVID. So I think of this webinar as an organizing webinar, one that will generate ideas and questions, strategies, and coalitions. And to that end, the Institute on Inequality and Democracy will provide follow-up resources to participants via email. And we have 4 fantastic panelists with us today to help us with these ideas and questions, and I'm going to introduce them now in alphabetical order to get us started. So Raul Carrillo serves as the board chair of the Modern Money Network, an interdisciplinary educational initiative promoting public understanding of money, finance, law, and the economy. He also sits on the boards of the National Jobs for All Network and the Our Money campaign. By day, Raúl is policy counsel at the Demand Progress Education Fund and a fellow at the Americans for Financial Reform Education Fund, where he advises on issues related to financial technology. Previously, he was a staff attorney at the New Economy Project and special counsel to the enforcement director at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Alexis Goldstein spent 7 years on Wall Street, working in tech for the equity derivatives trading desks before I met her 10 years ago on the steps of Occupy Wall Street. Alexis now serves as senior policy analyst at Americans for Financial Reform. She is an advisory board member for the Project on Predatory Student Lending at Harvard Law School and a sought-after expert on issues of higher education, financial policy, and markets. She's a regular contributor to Truthout, and her writing has been featured in The Progressive, The New Republic, The Washington Post, and The Nation. She's also co-creator of the Humorless Queers podcast, which blends serious analysis with witty commentary on notoriously somber topics, including mass surveillance and Wall Street malfeasance. Christopher Newfield is Distinguished Professor of English at the University of California, Santa Barbara. His fields are US literature before the Civil War and after World War II, critical university studies, critical theory, quantification studies, and the intellectual and social effects of the humanities. He's written a trilogy of books on the university as an intellectual and social institution. The first, Ivy and Industry, Business in the Making of the American University, 1880 to 1980, came out in 2003. Unmaking the Public University, The 40-Year Assault on the Middle Class from 2008. And The Great Mistake, How We Wrecked Public Universities and How We Can Fix Them from 2016. He blogs on higher education policy at Remaking the University and has written for the Huffington Post, Inside Higher Ed, the Chronicle of Higher Education, the Guardian's Higher Education Network, and the Los Angeles Review of Books. And rounding out our fantastic panelists today is Nick Mitchell, Associate Professor in the Department of Feminist Studies and the Program in Critical Race and Ethnic Studies at UC Santa Cruz. Investigating the social arrangements of knowledge and the work of knowledge in shaping social worlds, Professor Mitchell has published widely, including a recent piece on summer labor in academia and the widely read, collectively authored Abolitionist University Studies, An Invitation. Professor Mitchell is at work on 2 forthcoming monographs. One, A History of University Neoliberalism Through the Lens of Black Studies and Women's Studies. The other, a collection of essays that explore the university's resistance to being theorized. Central to our purposes here, Professor Mitchell has also been a central faculty member in the cost of living adjustment wildcat strike in the UC system. Okay, so with those fabulous panelists, the format will be as follows. We've posed 2 questions to the panelists in advance. Question 1, please name and explain alternatives to austerity in higher education available to us now. And then question 2, please name and explain long-term alternatives to austerity that we can seed now, but will stretch far beyond this moment. Each panelist will have 5 minutes to answer question 1, and then we'll do another round of 5-minute answers to question 2. And I will be helping you panelists by holding up a 1-minute warning to try to keep you on time, because we hope that this sort of speed dating format will leave ample time for a Q&A session with the audience at the end. And audience, please notice that you have a Q&A chat where you can put in your questions. And as soon as we get through those 2 questions with each of the panelists, we'll open it up. So we'll start and end each round with our university-based participants. So Professor Newfield, I would love to start with your answer to question 1. Please name and explain alternatives to austerity in higher education available to us now.
Oh, thanks, Hannah. I'm really glad to be part of this crew and this discussion. This is kind of a plea for budget studies as a way of dealing with austerity. In other words, really trying to understand how the money works in your own workplace and in your own institution. I mean, there's a certain amount of anxiety that this whole topic arouses in people, quite understandably. But I really feel like that's the first step, is kind of a psychological shift towards feeling comfortable demanding a much more budget clarity than we actually have, and then starting to work with the numbers, and then thirdly, developing alternative budgets as a result of that. So just to kind of illustrate this, I'm going to talk about the University of California for a minute, which is the case that I understand the best, and then I'm going to make some proposals about ways that this university, as an example, can get out of the hole that COVID, it was already starting to be in, and that COVID is really pushing it in completely. So the budget. The University of California has a $40 billion total budget, but the core that is applied to teaching and learning is really only about 10 billion of that. Okay, so that's about 1/4 of what you think of as the overall, or what is described as the overall UC budget, which includes medical centers and a bunch of other stuff. Losses that are tied specifically to COVID for the current year, that the losses really began in March and they're going to extend through June, so it's really only 4 months, are going to be about $1 billion just on the campus, and that includes Bill's healthier campus, and it also includes some less healthy campuses. The total losses for the UC system, so that's on the 40 billion base, are about 2.7 billion, so just round it off to 3, and you can see a fairly substantial hole that's being dug already. Okay, now think about 2020 to 2021. The best case scenario now is that really only fall is online, and winter and spring we can start to kind of go back and get things back to normal, and there's a whole bunch of problems with that scenario that I think we're all pretty aware of, but let's posit that that's actually possible. The best case for 2021 is that UC only loses $2 billion. So the best case loss for these two periods of time, the current year and next year, is about a 3 billion loss on the core. If we stay close to the end of 2021, that is, we're mostly online, we lose residential income, we lose a bunch of other revenue streams, overseas students, et cetera. We're looking at more like a $4.8 billion loss for next year. So that is actually 50% of the core revenues for this gigantic public university if we can't figure out how to reopen in 2021 at all. Okay, so that's, I mean, for me, that's the first place to start, just to see the magnitude of the problem. And, my immediate conclusion is cuts, 10% furloughs, et cetera, layoffs aren't going to solve a problem of this magnitude, even if we tried to use that. In other words, it's such a colossal catastrophe that something other than the kind of whittling away version of austerity that we were used to from 2008 to 2011 is not going to work at all. So here's some things that we can do more or less immediately. The first thing is tap UC's reserves. So Ask Me did a pretty interesting budget presentation on Tuesday that some of you, I love that sign, 1 minute to fix austerity. That's all it's going to take me, Hannah. There's about $5 billion in the system, they estimate, in excess liquidity beyond the requirements that are set by bond analysts, et cetera. So that can, some of that can be tapped. There's borrowing capacity that both Bill and Hannah have already mentioned. And then the third, which both of you have already mentioned, is a push for federal grants to states that the states would then pass on to essential functions like higher ed, which it absolutely is. So for me, the demand to start with is full immunity from the cuts. In other words, being made whole 100%, and then working the budget analysis backwards to figure out how much money has to come from where to get that 100% indemnity. And the good news is that we actually do have borrowing and reserve capacity and grant capacity from the federal government to make that possible.
Okay, I have children in the background, so I'm muting on and off. But Alexis, let's go ahead and switch to you for question 1. Please name and explain alternatives to austerity in higher education that are available to us now.
Thanks, Hannah, and it's nice to be here with everybody today. So I'm going to mention a few things, but I want to start with a little story because I feel like before I get into like the levers, I just want to talk about what I see as the austerity mindset and how if we don't sort of work to deconstruct and debunk the austerity mindset, it's hard to use some of the tools that are available to us. And the story I want to tell is about the HEROES Act, which is a bill that just passed the House. It had pretty much only Democratic support. And on Tuesday of last week, the HEROES Act included $10,000 in federal student debt cancellation and $10,000 in private student debt cancellation. And then 48 hours later, on Thursday, that bill was changed to narrow that debt cancellation only to people who are defined as economically vulnerable. And those were people who are in default, deferral, forbearance, or eligible for a $0 a month income-driven repayment plan. But if you're paying $25 a month, you're out of luck. If you lost your job after March 12th and became eligible for $0 a month, you're ineligible. And the reason that the House leadership gave for why they made this change was cost. They said, we were surprised by the cost. It was $250 billion. Side note, no one should have been surprised about that cost. We know how much student debt there is. We can do that math. 45 million people times, $20,000 is actually a lot less than the cost that they came up with. But there's this mentality that we have to pick and choose different things. And part of that mentality doesn't exist when we look at things like tax cuts. So when we think back to when the Republicans pushed forward the tax cuts, they said, well, the tax cuts are going to provide such an economic boost that they'll pay for themselves. Student debt cancellation, and I would argue funding higher education broadly and free public college, is also something that would have an economic boost that would make it pay for itself in many ways. But we don't hear that when we consider things like that. We only hear that when we look at tax cuts, right? That's sort of like dynamic scoring where we figure out the future value of whatever we're doing only comes into account when we're taking, basically, when we're giving money to rich people and never when we're giving money to the public. So I feel like that's something we need to attack and dismantle if we have any hope of using some of the tools that we have available now. The one other thing I want to say is, I'm going to be the skunk at the garden party here. So colleges and universities are basically making an argument right now that they can either get funding or there can be debt cancellation for their students and their alumni. That is an argument that the College and University Association, ACE, which 1,700 colleges and universities belong to, including many people in the UC system. And they said, if you do debt, so first of all, give us money. We're colleges. Please give us money. Please, Congress, give us money. If you do debt cancellation, you should narrow it only to the financially distressed, which is exactly what Congress did last week. They did what the colleges and universities asked them to do. If you do debt cancellation, keep it narrow, only give it to people who are distressed. So colleges effectively pitted their aid against the aid for students and alumni, and this is a false choice. We don't have to choose between helping schools and helping students, because doing either of those things, research shows, at least for debt cancellation, and I'm sure I'm not as familiar with research about free public college, but there's very clear research that shows canceling student debt boosts the economy for everyone. So in terms of tools, one is organizing, right? If folks here want to agitate within their own schools and universities and say, listen, not only should you be on the record asking for more money as an institution, you need to represent the students and you need to advocate for debt cancellation on behalf of students. It would boost the economy for everyone. One other tool I want to mention, so that was a bad change that happened in the HEROES Act between Tuesday and Thursday. There was a good change that happened too. So there is a facility that was created as a result of the pandemic called the Main Street Lending Facility that is currently using taxpayer money to absorb any losses on loans given out by that facility. That facility was previously only available and is currently only available to corporations. There was a change to the HEROES Act that would say we would open up that facility to institutions of higher education so they could get these same wonderful loans that are backed by taxpayers as corporations can, there's a bunch of problems with the accountability measures on those loans, right? They don't require that people stay on payroll and things like that, but at least it would sort of help, fix the counterbalance between, private companies getting it and universities not. And I just will say, in addition to it being in the HEROES Act, there is a package by Representative Maxine Waters of California that will also be advocating for this. And I believe there's a bill by Joyce Beatty, who is of Ohio. So the Main Street Lending Facility is one tool that exists now that we could use now to fund institutes of higher education.
Thank you so much, Alexis. So as I promised, bookending with academics, Raul, will go to you. Please name and explain alternatives to austerity in higher education that are available to us now.
Sure thing. Thanks again, everybody, for having me here. I'm really happy to participate. I'm going to offer just a few comments on the legal and technical design of a response. But first, let me just say that this is sort of offered in the spirit of auxiliary support. And I just want to thank everybody who's engaged in debt strikes, event strikes, and sick outs, and other expressions of solidarity, because really confronting austerity at the end of the day, I think, demands political momentum, and these ideas sort of don't really matter unless there's political counterpower being mounted. So thank you all to everyone who's doing the work. So I represent a perspective, or I'm associated with a paradigm known as modern monetary theory, that most people who are on the internet are familiar with as a body of economic thought that sort of says that the United States government can't go broke. Well, that is a programmatic insight. What really the core, I think, of this paradigm is that a maxim that's very lucidly expressed by Dr. Stephanie Kelton, who was formerly an advisor to Senator Bernie Sanders and the US Senate Budget Committee. And that insight is that money does not grow on rich people. So essentially, when we're talking about funding coming from the Fed or the Treasury down to universities or whatsoever, what the key thing to keep in mind is that money is a tool of law and policy, rather than something that just naturally exists in the markets. The COVID-19 pandemic response and measures taken by the Fed, et cetera, right now are highlighting or casting into relief just how malleable public finance is. We're seeing lots of things that are happening that are completely constitutional and legal, but haven't been sort of undertaken previously because people don't consider crises that are not of this nature to be chronic enough to demand a transformational response from public finance. So that being said, MMT is usually taken as a body of thought that only applies to the federal level, and it sort of leaves people in concrete situations with a feeling of a lack of agency, right? So if the federal government can, spend all kinds of money according to the Constitution, et cetera, what does that mean when we're at the state and local level? And what does that mean concretely in the context of higher education? So first I'll say that, if I had my druthers, what would be happening right now is the Treasury would be sending money directly to households, to universities in the form of debit cards, as well as federal bank accounts, but we don't have that system in place. And so what can state universities do? What can public universities do right now on their own? And I want to sort of flag an idea that's been promoted by my group, the Modern Money Network, as something that can be done immediately, even though it sounds a little bit off the wall. So during the Great Depression, a lot of institutions started circulating community or complementary currencies. Now, this is how they do things if, in a roaring, healthy economy, they want more, money from the federal government or more money in general just to operate. But during the Great Depression, some political subdivisions started circulating their own sort of currency to use for payments. Now, I don't have to tell anybody here that universities sort of form their own payment ecosystems within neighborhoods and cities. And that raises complications in the sense that a lot of the effects that universities have on their local economies are bad, as Mr. Mitchell and other folks, or Professor Mitchell and other folks have highlighted, right? There's gentrification, there's settler colonialism kind of at the root of how university microeconomies operate. But at the same time, universities pay a lot of people. So in the same way that the federal government gives us dollars and we use those dollars to pay our taxes, ostensibly, a university could issue notes or a complementary currency. At the Modern Money Network, we like to call them unis to mimic the language of munis for municipal governments. And those can be used to trade and buy certain services, right? Now, this doesn't solve the deeper structural problem of missing money, but so long as these notes are usable to pay rent to a university, if that's your landlord, to pay tuition, to buy other things, then they circulate as a form of currency. And the ultimate way to backstop this currency and create a payment ecosystem that keeps people employed, that keeps people, the sort of, again, the university microeconomy humming, is to have the Fed use its 14.2 authority, which Alexis alluded to, which would entail the Fed buying these sort of notes from the university at the end of the day. And so what this would do is offer some sort of a lifeline and resiliency to, again, these microeconomies in the meantime, until we have the chance to straighten things out at the federal level. And I'm sure I'll engage with a lot of what folks have said, especially Professor Newfield, because I think we share a perspective on just letting the money kind of rip here. But for now, I'll stop.
Amazing. Alternative currencies in 5 minutes. Okay, finally, Professor Mitchell, to you. Please name and explain alternatives to austerities in higher education available to us now.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be in conversation with all of you. I have so much to think through and respond to in all of your remarks. I think the quick response that I have to think through right now is the alternative is also the means, and I think it's to organize as students, organize with students, and to reorganize the category of the student. I think we at Santa Cruz have a pretty interesting perspective on what this moment means because of, sorry, I'm in Oakland, it's loud, because of the extent to which many of the means of managing the pandemic are also means that were deployed in managing or attempting to avoid the strike. And so we saw so much how Zoom was being used effectively as a strike breaking technology before it was being seen as a pandemic management technology, and thinking about how the convergence of these different kinds of technologies that have been deployed as a means to really interrupt the potential solidarities between different kinds of labor organizations that have been emerging on campus, especially in the most recent moments. So really thinking about like the ways in which the universities, the technologies that are being used to manage this COVID moment are really effectively kind of strike-breaking technologies. Organizing with students as faculty. So in many ways, one of the primary ways that I think that faculty could be useful in the context of this moment is to greater publicize what your students are going through, and to actually make more widely available the narrative of what students are actually experiencing in this moment. I think that in many ways, the very category of the student has been privatized, and it's been because students who are categorized as legal dependents don't have access to the stimulus check, et cetera, et cetera. So thinking about what that actually means to understand both the practical activities of your student and more largely what it means to be a student in this moment. And I think that can help us to do stuff like reorganize the category of the student. Historically speaking, I think that we don't quite have a much more complicated narrative of how we can account for the historical formation of different understandings of the student. So students effectively in universities today become means of transfer between financial institutions and universities, or in the cases of graduate students, they become means by which the university pays itself. So universities pay graduate student a wage, and graduate students pay for university housing, or universities give to graduate students a tuition waiver, and that tuition waiver just gets paid through the university. So thinking about different ways of rethinking the category of the student so that it actually opens up new modes of organizing, new ways of imagining, and new modes of fighting precarity. I think one of the most important ways of framing that is actually to think about revitalizing the idea of a wages for students movement. And using this as a moment for actually highlighting the fact that in moments of crisis, the very category of the student becomes a reveals the ways in which it's become a means of producing various kinds of precarity and also reducing the kinds of claims that people have on sociality and social entitlement. So how can we actually revise the category of the students so that it can enliven and be infused with different ways of imagining solidarity? That's the big question that I want to think through. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for our speed dating round one. And there's some really great questions popping up in the Q&A. What we're going to do is go through one more round with question 2 and then let the panelists answer questions. We think that will kind of maximize time to have more of a dialogue with these questions. So thank you for your questions. Please feel free to keep them coming. When this round ends, we'll open up to those questions. So again, the question for round 2, starting again with you, Professor Newfield. Now, please name and explain long-term alternatives to austerity that we can seed now, but that will and should stretch far beyond this moment.
I think there's 3 things, or at least is how I think of it myself, as in a sequence. I mean, the first is critique, right? So we already know that austerity doesn't work, and we proved this in 2008 through 11, and there's been lots of empirical rebuttals of the economic work that was done to suggest that you could have something like expansionary austerity and you had to keep national debt levels below 90% of GDP, et cetera. I mean, so that critique is important. And the other thing to point out is something that I and others have already mentioned, which is that we're looking at a new depression, and austerity as a wealth transfer mechanism upward that tweaks, and trims and cuts over time social systems that people need and that are actually constituted and created by society, isn't going to deal with the order of magnitude of the problem that we have in the first place. So that's the first thing. And I think that's quite important. The second, though, I think of as a kind of deep psychosocial work, social psychological work. And I mean, to cut people, you have to make their work invisible to, the bystander of society, to, allow student debt to pile up in the way that it has. You have to make the burden of student debt invisible to most folks as they go about their daily lives. You have to make the loss to the university of firing people invisible to the regents, to managers, to voters, just to people on the outside of the system. It's only at that point that people will really consent to the objectification of the folks that are being disposed of in that way. And then at that point, you can enact the kind of the social violence that furloughs and firings and just this idea that you can just kind of throw people back into the general pond and let them fend for their.
You just accidentally muted yourself after the general pond.
Yeah, but I intentionally unmuted myself again, so hopefully it'll stay that way. So I think part of this, how do we get as a group, and this includes employees, it includes students, and I think this overlaps a lot with what Nick was just saying. How do we learn to refuse to consent to our own objectification? And this is an urgent issue at every level that I work with in the university, because it's happening at the top as well, where it's kind of slouching towards austerity is happening as people fatalistically organize their psychic lives in relation to being cut and diminished, and just thinking that that's okay, and we have to that's the way we're going to get through this. It's completely wrong. If you look at it from above, it's completely wrong. Our systems will not survive with the scale of cuts that people are going to start talking about in the next couple of months. So the psychic reordering has to happen now so that we can resist, and we're resilient, and we're defiant, and we're militant. That's absolutely essential. And then in a state of defiance and militance, psychologically speaking and collectively speaking, There's the third thing, which is the policy. So here, I'm just going to rattle off some names and stop. Firing freeze, full employment. There should be just an absolute freeze on firing, not on hiring. The second is something that I've started to call free college plus, which is debt abolition, free tuition, debt-free college as the goal for that, coupled with a reinvestment in students at a level of $20,000 per student per year as a way of keeping the poor colleges that poor students go to in the game of, you know, creation and mobility and the other stuff that college is about that they can't do now because they're poor, even before COVID. Third thing, Green New Deal. I'll just use that as a title because everybody kind of knows what that involves. Massive works progress project, full employment, getting people to work to rebuild the infrastructure in the ways that we all understand we're going to have to do in the next 10 years anyway. And then finally, something like a arts project administration. Paula Krebs, the executive director of the Modern Languages Association, wrote a nice piece on the CNN website about reinventing the New Deal for today in a way that puts cultural producers back to work, including our students that are graduating out of humanities and social sciences programs into oblivion without the kind of collectively funded public support that they deserve. So once we get our minds in order as a group and as a society, I think that all of this stuff is possible and progress and redevelopment will happen.
Wonderful, thanks so much. So Alexis, now to you, question 2. Please name and explain long-term alternatives to austerity that we can seed now, but stretch far beyond this moment.
Thank you, Hannah. So I would say that we have to break the power of finance and Wall Street if we are to have any hope of fighting austerity. And one of the ways that we can do that is we need mechanisms for accountability that do not exist currently. I have a very large fear that we are going to come out of this pandemic and there's going to be, 10 companies. There's going to be Costco, there's going to be Amazon, Target, Walmart, and some of these companies are going to merge. Believe it or not, some of the too big to fail banks, there was a story that they might want to take over oil companies because the banks loan the oil companies money. The oil companies are about to go bankrupt. The banks don't want to sell off the oil fields at a loss. So you might see like a JP Morgan, Exxon by the end of all of this. I mean, I don't really think Exxon's going to go under, but I'm being hyperbolic for the sake of illustration. So the United States has just straight up failed to do any kind of accountability for our rescue program. If you look at our neighbors farther north, Canada has an emergency lending program that they called LEAF, the Large Employer Emergency Financing Program. They say you have to protect your pensions if you take a loan, which what's a pension? That's funny, but you have to protect pensions. You can't lay anybody off. The companies can't give out any dividends or do stock buybacks. And you have to do a climate disclosure about what your impact is on the climate as a firm. We have none of that here, right? The only industry that had any conditions was airlines. So I feel like why is that, right? It's because capital is too powerful in the United States, finance is too powerful. How do we break that power up? One way that you can do that is, so there's so much money sloshing around the system and none of it is going to public goods. None of it's going to education. Capital is chasing things like private equity funds that are used as a sort of way to oppress labor, right? They take over companies, they fire people, they strip the company for parts. There is a proposal by an academic, two academics, Saleh Omarova and Robert Hackett, they're both at Cornell Law School, for sort of a revitalization of something we did after the Great Depression. So after the Great Depression, they sort of re-juiced up this Hoover era program called the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. And they used it to invest in everything, big things, small things, hair salons, giant companies, anything you can imagine. And if you added up all of the money that the Reconstruction Finance Corporation had at its disposal, it was bigger than Wall Street. We have nothing like that now. All of the funding mechanisms now, it's basically Congress appropriates money and the private sector decides what they want to invest in. The proposal that these two academics came up with is called the National Investment Authority. And the idea is to try and suck up some of this capital that's being put into toxic projects now and divert it to public projects. So instead of a public-private partnership the way we envision it now, where public money gets handed to private corporations, we suck up private money from the private sector and devote it to public companies. And the whole thing is managed by a new entity that is again based on this Depression era program, but is sort of sits between the Treasury and the Fed. And it could be used to fund things like the Green New Deal, because it would have a time horizon of investment that is longer than any greedy investor would ever accept, right? Investors want their money tomorrow. At the latest, they want it at the end of the year. They're certainly never going to invest in a project that is only going to be profitable after they're dead. The government can do things like that. And so pension funds, you know, university endowments, they invest their money with private equity companies, right? Because they're seeking yield because they're trying to fill these unbalanced budgets. And the idea behind this proposal is this would be a safe investment that would pay you a little bit more than your traditional safe investments like treasuries. And it would be a way to basically invest in something that would help all of society. And it would suck up some of that, hopefully, we hope, pension fund money, insurance company money that want sort of safe yields that are currently going to these greedy Wall Street actors. And so it's just one idea. There's a lot of different ways to sort of operationalize this, but it's the best proposal I've seen that talks about this. But the real goal is whatever means you use to do this, we need to break the power of Wall Street because they're the ones making all of these decisions, at least from where I sit, right? I sit in Washington, D.C., so I'm watching, who is getting the money out of the CARES Act and all of these packages. And the people who've been getting the money are, the $454 billion that are going to corporations. And in my mind, the long-term solution is we need a way to reduce the power of, corporations. And so the way that you do that is you got to find a way to suck up some of their money and put it somewhere else. Thanks.
Wonderful. Okay, Raul, to you, question 2. Please name and explain long-term alternatives to austerity that we can see now, but that will stretch far beyond this moment in higher ed and beyond.
Thanks. So I'll hit 2 points roughly. One is making funding of higher education and rights and entitlements in general more direct, and that's going to integrate with some of the points that Alexis just made. And the second is the need to move away from local fiscal control of education funding. So on the first point, I fully agree with my colleague Alexis that we need to move away from having high finance in the driver's seat. And I would just highlight that that's not only for reasons of social justice, but for resiliency of the economy. So I would argue, and folks in my network would argue, especially Nathan Tankis, who is running a blog kind of detailing the crisis as it unfolds, is that the US economy is particularly susceptible to the pandemic because of the way in which it relies on household debt, right? So you can sort of, to borrow a crude leftist analogy, view high finance as a parasite on the rest of the economy, right? But when folks can't get income for the parasite to eat, then what we're left over is with the debt, right? And everything sort of comes to a halt a bit. And what high finance has turned into a debt relationship is essentially the functions that we need to reproduce society socially, right? Our essential work. So that includes education, healthcare, housing, all these things that we need run on private household debt that empowers high finance. So we absolutely have to turn away from that model for reasons not only of equity, but for economic resiliency and stability. If the economy runs again on people's credit and they don't have income to fund that credit or make payments, then it is all going to come to a halt. So we need to move towards a system that is opposite of that. Now, as much as I support ideas like the Reconstruction Finance Corporation as being certainly better than the status quo, I do think that the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. So what we need to be doing is having congressional appropriations pay for as many things as possible. Of course, that's always easier said than done. But I would argue that if we're talking about rights and entitlements, and again, socially necessary work and socially necessary endeavors, it's kind of sort of time to put our money where our mouth is. Of course, this runs into a different problem, which is that of paying for it, right? Like, do we raise taxes on people in order to provide higher education in good times and bad? Are people amenable to that? And in my experience, this sort of narrative that we need to raise taxes, especially at the federal level, to match any spending is not real. And the Republicans don't care about it when they're talking about war, when they're talking about deportation, when they're talking about incarceration. It's the Democrats, in fact, who come back to the austerity narrative in general and the idea that we have to offset spending with taxes. And we saw that last week as Speaker Pelosi sort of started to say, well, I'm concerned about the national debt, I'm concerned about taxpayer money, et cetera, so maybe we need to slow down a little bit on the pandemic response. Ultimately, if we truly care about things, we have to fund them up front, regardless of what the offset is, I think. And I think this is especially important when it comes to education, and it's especially important when you consider the racialized economy. If there's one book on public finance that I could recommend that folks read over the past couple of years, it's a book called Racial Taxation by legal historian Camille Walsh, which talks about how rights to education, or the struggle for rights to education, were stymied by the desire for local fiscal control, by concern about where taxpayers' money is going. So as much as accountability is important, I think sort of putting taxpayers in charge of where money goes, or saying that their votes matter most, or the implication being that the more you pay in taxes, the more of a say you have, is something we have to depart from completely. And we need to adopt a model that says if something as important as education needs to be funded, then we essentially need to write a blank check, and we have to worry about inflation and that sort of thing. But ultimately, the things we care about need to be funded in the same way that the GOP tries to fund the things it cares about right now. So war, incarceration, generally enriching those who already have enough. So those are my two notes, just moving away from the debt finance model and then local fiscal control, which I think is especially important in terms of education.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Raul. So Professor Mitchell, to you at the end, question 2, please name and explain long-term alternatives to austerity in higher education that we concede now, but will stretch far beyond this moment.
So it feels very academic to say that I think that we need a theory, but I actually do think that we need a movement and a class struggle based theory of the university that takes seriously the encounter of various kinds of social movements, marginalized, oppressed, racialized populations vis-a-vis the university. And I think that this is important for a few reasons. And in the beginning, I just want to point everyone to a recent study done by Robert Lee and Christian Natone called Land Grab University. It's in High Country News, Land Grab University, and it's just an extensive study of the extent and the just how prevalent the kinds of displacement that were necessary to generate capital and land for what we now call land-grant universities was, and restores at least a sense of the integrity and importance of reckoning with Native people's claim to that land as well, which is not always the land that universities themselves are cited on. And I think that in starting there, we can actually start generating a theory of the university that literally operates from the ground up. And in doing so, it helps us to rethink about the contours of a struggle, of what a university struggle is. I think one of the interesting and important things that a lot of people who were involved with the cost of living adjustment movement encountered was the way that undergraduate students felt a stake in the overall questions that the movement was addressing, even though ostensibly it began as a movement to address the precarious wages of graduate students, and how in the process of engaging that struggle, and there were plenty of frictions in the course of it, that struggle also had to start encountering, you know, its own relationships to policing, and how the university started deploying massive forces of police in order to try and police the strike. And so all of a sudden, what began, or what was imagined as a certain kind of university struggle, in the course of struggling itself became a different kind of struggle, and revealed itself a different kind of university that only appears when struggle is engaged on certain terms. So taking that seriously, the police part of the university is no less a part of the university than the classroom part of the university. And those experiences that come from actually building movements within the context university should be part of our theory of the university. The idea that universities, you know, create social mobility oftentimes obscures the actual experience of being in university, which is of poverty, which is of unwaged labor, which is of various forms of precarity confronting and reinforcing each other. So if we actually think of a long-term goal as beginning to generate a theory of the university worthy of the kind of encounter and movements that we want to be able to build in the university, and takes the historicity of those movements seriously, I think that it's actually a good project for thinking about integrated forms of movement building. And, you know, I often reiterate that if you count students as workers, there's literally no bigger employer in the country than the University of California, except for Walmart. So if you actually start encountering the university on those terms, and understanding, if we think about it in that way, we also understand that the university is a mass producer of low wage and unwaged labor, except it calls those unwaged laborers students. We actually end up having a lot of different bases for thinking about where struggles can emerge from.
Thank you so much, Professor Mitchell and everybody. And I'm now going to turn to a wonderful list of questions. And I want to apologize in advance. We have many attendees at this webinar, in the hundreds, I think. And so we're not going to be able to answer all of these questions, or even sift through them appropriately to pick which ones to answer. But thank you, and please keep them coming. And both Dean Maurer and I will try our best. So I think what we'd like to do maybe is pose a couple questions at a time, and then panelists who feel so moved, hopefully Dean Maurer, including you, I think you have a set of expertise that's complementary here, and interesting set of experiences, can speak back to. So first, a couple that are related and quite specific, which is questions about endowments. Can we talk about endowments? Why not just pull funds from endowments? How can we stop paying fees to hedge funds to manage them? How can we break the "we can't touch the endowment" mindset? And related to that, somebody asked a question specifically to something Professor Newfield said, which is about, I think, the liquidation of the Blue and Gold Fund. So is that an endowment? Is UC already doing this in some ways, but also the kind of broader endowment questions? Maybe let's start there. Sorry, free for all, just go for it.
Well, I'll just say one thing quickly. Endowments are unliquidatable until they are. So there are 4 major pools at the University of California, and it does seem that the General Endowment Fund has been liquidated, although I get contradictory information about this. And this is just one of the signs that we need more of a mass movement around budget clarity and just budget disclosure. I wouldn't even call it transparency, so that all the constituents of any given university can have a conversation about what is to be done with the funds that are actually available. So it is touchable and it is movable. It's just it's a political struggle. It's not there are some technical limitations, but generally speaking, and the ASME talk that I mentioned before on Tuesday laid this out pretty well. There's much more liquidity than is usually admitted, and this is the time to tap into it.
How do we get the hedge funds out of there, Alexis?
I mean, I think my knee-jerk answer is organizing. And I think a lot of that is already happening. I mean, I think we're seeing it in the divestment movement, right? There's a lot of amazing student organizing trying to get universities to divest from fossil fuels from their endowments. And I'm less familiar if there's broader organizing specifically around why are we investing with hedge funds or private equity funds that are sort of attacking labor at every turn. But I can't imagine there's organizing I'm just not aware of, but more of it I think would be my main answer to that. I think also regulation is another answer, but that's obviously a more difficult thing given that we are going in the opposite direction for that, right? Like we're seeing a shock doctrine happening right now. Corporate entities and capital is using the pandemic as an excuse to do a smash and grab power play in every instance. So you could also get the hedge funds out of endowments if we regulated them, but I think the moment for that right now is not very ripe.
Awesome. Okay, so from somebody who may be a student, I really appreciate and am invigorated by Dr. Mitchell's explanation of how to recategorize the student. How can faculty and students also work to direct our narratives of experience to university administrators who, not Bill, appear not quite attuned to who our students are and their daily needs and life experiences? And there are a series of questions in here that I'll expand. So that one, of course, to Professor Mitchell, but just about these questions of narrative and recategorization, telling us to refuse austerity. How do we refuse austerity? What are the narratives available to us? To whom do we refuse austerity? How do we recategorize ourselves in our context?
Yeah, and I think that the beautiful and difficult thing is that, like, we, in a lot of ways, we can raise questions, but the answers only come in the context of struggle, and it's the struggle itself that is the form of the answer to some of these questions. But I do think that one thing, well, it's a different question to answer how to make these narratives available of student life from the perspective of students and from the perspective of faculty. For the thing that I generally have learned is that when students organize to make those stories and make that information available, I see my role as faculty as just a relay. I'm like not a leader. Like I'm here to listen. I'm here to try and open up channels. I am using knowledge of the way that the university is organized in order to help direct things, and I'm using my legitimacy as a faculty member as something that can be, you know, a blunt instrument in the context of certain kinds of struggles. So I think that it's not my ideas that are necessarily needed. It's literally my structural position as faculty that can make certain narratives available to be hearable to administrators. I think that at the same time, like, administrators are not necessarily going to be open to things that are not presented forcefully. I think that the point of building movements is building force, and if you are open to the understanding that, yeah, the people who you want to hear you are not going to be the most necessarily available to hear you, or they'll hear you and kind of pat on the head, then yeah, I think that movement building is the way to make those stories heard.
Other responsive to narrative questions on austerity?
I mean, I think the story of the effects has to be told in the unblack boxing of the damage. And there, I mean, a lot of journalists are doing this now. You know, tales of illness and recovery, tales of death, tales of deprivation, you know, lines at food banks, general disarray and confusion. So, I mean, I'm, you know, I really like sort of arithmetic or mathematical stories personally, but I know that most people don't. And the other, there's just an abundance of the damage done genre story that I think needs to happen and to get out and to be told in a, you know, not in just a tear-jerking way, but in a in a way that allows the effects to be connected back to the structural causes that can in fact be re-engineered. I mean, the whole thing is just, it's so unnecessary that we exist in the, take a natural disaster and turn it into mass suffering and misery. And so there are also, stories of agency and redesign, I think, are just as important, and the kind of conversations we're having now are part of that process.
Great. Okay, I'm going to turn us to two questions on more the Fed side of things. So two of them. First one, if the UC floated bond measures designed for purchase by the Fed or the Main Street Lending Program, or perhaps the Municipal Liquidity Facility, what political obstacles, so in the UC or elsewhere, right, higher ed, broadly speaking, what political obstacles would need to be overcome? And how would you, our panelists, suggest this be approached? It's interesting that Jerome Powell is begging for the Fed money to be used. That's one of the questions. And the second question is on unis. I wanted to call them munis, but I didn't. I stopped myself. Is on unis in particular. And let me find that one. Question on the idea of a university currency. Given that the ultimate goal would be to have that currency brought back into the general monetary system through the Fed, but also given the intransigence of the political system, how would we keep university currencies from becoming a new company script that further denies remuneration for labor on and around campus?
So I can go ahead and answer that last question, perhaps in doing so speak a little bit to the first question. So, as I mentioned at the beginning, I don't think there's any detaching support for universities or the development, certainly, of university currencies from the broader actions that a university takes, which Professor Mitchell and other folks have sort of highlighted in their work as well as on this webinar today. And so what I would say, first of all, there are some legal protections available. Company script is not as easy to get away with as it was, back in the day. Hopefully, assuming the court holds up. But in any case, I think the bigger issue here is that complementary currencies create a site for political education and struggle as well. In no way is this a technical fix to something in a way that obviates politics, right? So the idea with the complementary currency is that it serves, first of all, as a source of political education about the way that money can work, but more importantly, it opens up space for participatory decision-making, right? Of course, it doesn't eliminate power structures within the university, but when you have a conversation about a university issuing its own currency, as opposed to paying dollars, currency that will be used to pay the university back at a later date, you get to have another conversation about what sort of jobs the university should be supporting. For instance, I would start with the most vulnerable essential workers is paid in the university currency to the extent that other currency is not available. But you can also start paying people for care work, for instance, for childcare at universities, for that sort of thing. And you can create new space to have another conversation about what it is that the university values based on where it puts its new money, right? So I see this as working ideally in concert with movements for solidarity, et cetera, and in conjunction with actions that are already underway. So it really creates another space for political struggle. And of course, certainly universities could use the currency in extractive ways, but I think it also opens up an opportunity to discuss some of these questions in the context of praxis, some of the questions that Professor Mitchell and other folks have highlighted.
And I can take a stab at that first question. The problem is there's an alphabet soup issue of all of these different facilities, so I'm not entirely sure which facility was being referred to, but the Fed is doing a lot of different things. So the Main Street Lending Program, the Fed has taken billions of dollars that taxpayers have provided, and those billions of dollars are used as a loss absorbing mechanism. And then the Fed is basically saying, we're going to be this backstop with this money we got from Treasury. And then the banks make the loans to private companies. Then there's a different facility called the TAO where the Fed is actually buying assets. So I'm guessing the question was perhaps more about that because it was about universities issuing bonds. But there's no real reason you would have to use one approach or the other. But I think universities are going to want the most beneficial conditions to them. They're not going to want many constraints, just the way that corporations have insisted on minimal constraints. And my fear is whatever, Fed facility is opened up to universities, the impulse seems to be to have no conditions, right? No requirement to keep workers on payroll, no requirement that you don't give big bonuses to whoever, university administrators, coaches, I don't know, or pay them these very ridiculously high salaries that they get paid. And I think the impetus would be on, organizing within the university to make sure that if universities are taking these dollars, that there are some conditions put on that. And unfortunately, the Fed and the US Congress, quite frankly, has been incredible, totally unhelpful in creating any of those conditions. So I think the problem, having universities issue bonds that the Fed then buys could be a solution to the problem of budgets. But if there aren't meaningful conditions on those bonds to ensure that everyone stays on payroll as just a baseline, it could be another mechanism to sort of, punch everybody in the face, for it to say it in a very untechnical way. And I don't know the best way to organize around that. I would kick that back to the rest of the panel, or even to those of you on this webinar. How do you demand those conditions?
There needs to be much broader participation within universities in these kind of conversations. And that's how, so unionized workers, unrepresented employees, including all tenure track faculty at UC at least, students, graduate students, need to be part of the laying of conditions down on borrowing. I don't see any other way around that, because it's not going to happen at the top. It just, people need to know that it's even an option.
So apropos more people at universities getting more involved, there's one question: how does one begin to research who, how, and where a university's debt is being held? And even more broadly, how does one begin to research who, how, and where budget decisions are taking place, how we can have more say in them? And people are rightly critiquing the question of the we in the chat, right? So the multiple and conflicting and intersectional we's, right, that we're all variously a part of. So if people want to address those questions, how do we understand where a university's debt is being held? How might we go about researching that? But also, I think expanding it more broadly to this question of budgetary participation. And again, I just want to flag Ohio State University faculty-led open source online collaborative budgeting project, just as an interesting model that has just emerged. But to the panelists.
Just give a technical answer for the first part of the question. Audited financial reports, and then in the case of the University of California, there are actually financial reports that break down various kinds of holdings. If you email me at UCSB, I will send you links.
I'll just jump in here. There have been a couple of questions about how does one bring together the political will to do some of the things that we're talking about. And we've talked about movement politics. There are also questions in the Q&A about, basic old-fashioned voting, especially in a world now of rampant voter suppression on the part of one political party. And then an interesting question that was here but then sort of disappeared, I don't know what happened to it, but I'm going to try to reconstruct it, which was, given that this is a political discussion, how can we shift the terms so that some of the ideas we're talking about sound like conservative ideas?
I mean, I do, just to the conservative idea question, I think about this a lot because, again, I live in DC and that's who runs this part of the country, unfortunately, on both sides of the aisle. But I feel like unfortunately, the thing that seems to work is talking about things in terms of economic stimulus. That seems to be what everybody's interested in. Lots of things are measurable in that way. I talked about it earlier, but student debt cancellation one is very measurable, but I also think that you can, you know, there's an externality problem, right? Like when I think about fossil fuels, we don't capture the sort of negative externalities, but we also don't put effort into capturing the positive externalities of so many different things. And I think if you sort of take that and like jam it into the sort of boring, like heterodox economics language of like, here's how much the state economy would be stimulated if we did X, Y, Z, like there are potential for people to be responsive to that. That's the trick that I always try to use. It takes a lot of research though, right, in order to come up with those estimates.
If there are no more,
I was going to answer
no,
my
go
own.
ahead.
I was going to answer my own question. The questions that I just posed myself, which goes back to something that Chris opened with at the very beginning, which is that if we haven't started already to learn budgets, we all have to start to learn budgets, right? And it's always so interesting to me to see what happens when we do start kind of democratizing access to budgets and the budgeting process, and how you get all kinds of new ideas, but also you see things that, you know, once appeared like this is just the way it has to be. And then you can ask the question, well, no, it doesn't have to be this way at all. How can we change this? How can we, you know, open things up and build a different kind of budget that better reflects our values and the kinds of changes that we want to see in the world. And just because there have been some questions also posted on how will we share things out later, we'll share things out later on the School of Social Sciences at UCI website and the Luskin Center website, including some of the articles and resources that have been mentioned. I think we're probably going to also want to put together a list of the alphabet soup that Alexis referenced so that people can know what these things are and learn more about them as we continue these sorts of discussions on our campuses.
And Bill, just a follow-up question to you. How, if people do want to start learning about budgets, literally, how do they do it? Where do they click? Where do they go? Dean Maurer.
First, go and read Chris Newfield. That's what I do. If you're a faculty member, there are all kinds of ways to be involved in the University of California anyway, in the Academic Senate, which is our faculty governing body, to begin to become more informed about some of these processes. Some of our campuses are better than others in terms of making things public and holding forums. I'm definitely going to look at this Ohio University open source budgeting example myself later. If it's a tool that we can use even locally within my school, that might be very interesting for people to see.
And
start with Chris's blog.
May I jump in? There's something I forgot to mention earlier that I think is relevant to the budget discussion. I just want to flag part of CARES gave money to institutions of higher education. It wasn't as much as they wanted, but there was a requirement that 50% of every dollar that institutions got went directly to students. And I never really believe on face value that that will happen without people monitoring it and making sure that 50% of the money actually went directly to students. So that's not really a budget thing per se, but I just want to flag it because people might want to ask that question at their own institutions. How much money did you get from CARES? And show me how 50% of it went directly to students.
Wonderful. So there's another suite of questions oh, I'm so sorry. Please go ahead.
Real quick, I would just add one complimentary note to what Bill and Alexis said. In encouraging people to sort of understand or try to gain a better sense of how budgets work, I'd encourage people to focus on federal as well as state and university budgets. What inevitably happens in the context of state budgetary politics is you wind up punching down or across when you're talking about a very small amount of funding, right? And I don't have to tell anybody here that historically higher education has been a chopping block within state budgets, in part because it's not constitutionally protected in the way that primary education is in most places. And it's not earmarked and funded with taxes in the way that primary education is. So it kind of is always, as long as it's trapped just on the state level, is this sort of target for cuts. So really, when we're talking about understanding public finance in general and the way that higher education is funding, we need to include the whole currency system in the federal government and talk about things like matching funding and direct allies, as well as just trying to jack up state taxes or otherwise within a very marginal space, try to give more money to higher education.
Thanks for that. So 2 points of wonderful clarification that are coming in the Q&A. One, I said Ohio State University for the open budget process, and Dean Maurer helpfully corrected me, as did somebody in the chat. It's actually Ohio University. And when we send out the resources, we will send links to that project as well. And somebody's also saying that the AAUP, which is the American Association of University Professors, actually runs a university budget training course every summer that some people have found helpful. So those are nice points of information. There are a couple, there are kind of some trying to bring together multiple questions. There are a couple questions on here about the difference between what's going on now and 2008, 2009 in terms of what's available to us in higher education. And related to that, I think, is a question about the sort of increasingly mainstream ideas of modern monetary theory. Right? That might actually be one answer in terms of what's different, but there was a different question about MMT. Yeah, I recall in the beginning of 2019, Powell, the Fed chair, dismissed MMT as something that was outrightly, oh, this keeps shifting, is something that was outrightly wrong. And I'm wondering if you all see any signs of change in perspectives on money. So the larger frame is, how is the moment we're in right now different from 2008, 2009, which everybody keeps analogizing it to within our systems and beyond? And then perhaps a kind of subsidiary, you know, we have MMT in the mainstream now in a way that we didn't before.
I would love to take a stab at that first one, if I may. So I was working on Wall Street in 2008. And every bank thought they were going to be nationalized. We were all afraid that the government was going to nationalize the banks, which is hilarious because there was only one person in Washington who proposed that, and her name was Sheila Bair, and she was a Republican FDIC chair. And the Obama sort of economics, Tim Geithner and Larry Summers, were like, absolutely not. We're not going to nationalize Citigroup. So I fear a repeat of that, right? There's some discussion about the government getting shares in some of these investments they're making, but they're non-voting shares, so you can't do anything with them. And I think the other difference that I would flag is, like 2008 was like, we were rescuing the banks. Now we're rescuing literally every private company. Like all of capitalism is too big to fail, and all of the workers are totally expendable. And I think what the Fed learned and what Congress learned from 2008 is do everything in the most complicated way you can possibly do it, and don't have Congress give money directly, make the Fed give the money so everyone is confused and doesn't know what's happening and can't hold them accountable. And I think that's what they did in 2008, and they're doing it again now. And that sort of goes back to that budget, why you need to be involved in the budget of your own school. And like, if you have the energy for it, why it would be good to look into the alphabet soup of what the Fed programs are doing, because they're basically robbing us blind in like broad daylight, but they're just putting it in 10 different facilities that are complicated and take some time to understand. And unfortunately, if we are going to fight it, we need to at least understand it. So both at like your micro level and your macro level. But I think the other thing I just want to flag that I forgot to mention earlier is, after the devastation of the last crisis, which, like, you know, Black and brown communities were disproportionately targeted with subprime loans, like people who own their homes outright, like bankers went in and were like, here, we're doing a reverse mortgage and let me give you some equity from your home. Like, then those communities were targeted again by for-profit colleges. And at least so far, there's been some efforts by the Democrats to keep for-profit colleges out of some of the money going to schools, but they were not excluded from the CARES money. And so again, we're going to see this sort of infighting between public institutions and private institutions that are all scrapping over the same amounts of money. And unfortunately, like, the powers that be are very interested. I don't know if people saw it, but Third Way was tweeting this week about a $4,000 refundable tax credit to allow you to do career education training, which is just a giveaway to for-profit colleges. And so all of these same bad ideas, unfortunately, are coming back all over again from 2008, but like worse.
Another lesson, just sort of on the ground from 2008, and where there is, again, a similarity potentially, is that when people accept cuts, they will be cut and then they will be cut again. So the lesson I think to draw from there is never accept a cut. And this is one of the reasons I think that the 100% whole, you know, make us whole, keep us whole. We can't afford a cut position is the only position to take going into this. You know, sort of like, do I resign or do I make them fire me? Always make them fire you. And any cut should be done coercively and with, you know, a kind of a violence that's really, that's visibly non-consensual, so that later on, when it comes to the question of clawbacks, which we have failed at getting at UC, the next time we may be able to be more successful.
I think that an interesting difference is that I think university administrations are, and especially the UC Office of the President, are less likely to think that they are going to be able to get away with across the board furloughs. And I think that because understanding the ways in which that actually got tenure stream faculty involved in movements who were not politicized and would not have been politicized in another moment, they're probably not going to make that same mistake again. I think also at this moment, in terms of academic instructional labor, the kinds of normalized precarity that came out of that moment have been further normalized. And so I think for a lot of people in graduate school right now, I was in graduate school in 2008, but like I think for a lot of people in graduate school right now, the idea that they're going to get a tenure track job once the economy recovers is just not, it is like a fantasy. And I think that also, especially when placed side by side with the point about the unlikeliness that they're going to target tenure stream professors for furloughs, makes it really incumbent to think about what we mean when we're talking about shared governance of the university. The academic senate is no longer the kind of unit that might be the basis of a democratic understanding of the university, especially in these kinds of, like, in a university that is just so structurally dependent on non-tenure stream labor, and that excludes the great majority of the people who actually teach the classes from making direct decisions about the conditions in which they work. So the idea of shared governance needs to be completely reconstituted. And in the struggles that come out of this kind of moment, I think that's an opportunity to really do it in line with non-tenure track faculty, in line with graduate students, in line with undergrads, in line with academic staff, and people who don't work in the academic services part of the university, but the university can't live without.
A fabulous answer. We have so many remaining great questions and just 2 minutes to the technical end of the webinar. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to, like, you know, what's that called? So I'm going to splatter paint just some questions, and if people want to jump in on final words, either in response to some of those questions, but also just to give people still listening a sense of some of the questions that remain. So, and then final words from our panelists. So a question about university as landlord. Could anybody speak to university housing, both in a financial budget context and as a site of organizing and reconceptualization? I teach at UCSD, and our campus's COVID response seems very much driven by a desire to get students back in dorms paying rent, whether or not their classes are in person. We're also trying to understand more about the financing of dorm construction on campus and the role of this in current budget conversations. So that's relevant to the bond conversation that we had earlier, right? That's one. Also an organizing question. Mention was made earlier of Zoom as a strike-breaking tool. Yet in an era where congregating bodily cannot be the baseline of organizing a movement, have we any choice but to use Zoom or similar tools in order to build movements? And then finally, there's a suite, not finally, but the final ones that I'll send out there is there's a suite of questions around, you know, the UC is a behemoth, right? As people have said over and over again, we're one of the largest employers in the state, if not the country, right? And California itself has this huge economy. We actually, we the UC have a lot of power. There are other smaller public institutions. What about collaboration between public and private institutions, or institutions that are so much smaller in this moment? Can we talk both about potentials for collaboration, but also some of those differences? And I feel like there was one, well, okay, I'm just gonna stop there.
If I could just offer, and I'm the outsider here, right? So this might not make sense, but the colleges organize a lot around that entity I mentioned earlier, ACE, 1,700 colleges, universities, and they do a lot of things that I would say are not helpful. So it would be nice to have a sort of alternative to that was agitating for more radical solutions.
Just a limited question of housing. Universities have increased housing charges and returns. They turned doubles into triples because the public funding side was never restored adequately, and they can't raise tuition in the way that they used to. So it's become an important revenue stream. And yeah, they are trying to reopen them because that's one of their alternative revenue streams to public funding. So it does seem like also another side of activism, since it's unlikely to be safe to do that. It's another chunk of funding that has to come from somewhere else, ideally or necessarily really from federal and state grants.
Just on the Zoom question, I think that it's a complicated question. I think that from one perspective, yeah, I think that there's not many other alternatives that we have that seem like really viable organizing means. And I just think that shouldn't necessarily get in the way of the critique. And also, we should really be investigating these technologies. Zoom, from my perspective, is accumulation hardware that appears to us as software rather than software itself. It allows for surveillance of what's going on any Zoom call at any time. It allows universities to accumulate information about different kinds of behaviors. It allows universities to accumulate confidence that this is a way that they can actually allow instruction to continue. So I think we need like more collective ownership of the means of sociality in general, and that can be a platform that work operates on, rather than giving employers the means of actually controlling how we connect with each other. I think that's part of the problem there.
Dean Maurer, maybe I'll just turn it over to you to see us out, but I will just turn one question into my own last word. There was a question about the term essential worker. We've seen the term essential worker enter the global lexicon overnight. How can we use this to our advantage as we make demands within our institutions, and even more broadly, as we make demand about what is essential and not expendable, right? Because essential worker has some very serious race, class, gender slippages, about the essential nature of reparative public goods in general and reparative public education more broadly. Dean Maurer.
Well, thank you. I first just want to acknowledge everyone for being here and sharing your perspectives and insights. I've learned a ton. There are certainly things for me that are actionable, as they say. Alexis, I'm going to go find out about ACE and then let's build a new one, because that's something that I know how to do. And Nick, your comments about kind of re-narrativizing and also kind of rethinking the position of the student is something incredibly useful to me as I think about the kind of work that I do now in spaces like this with our students who are near and far. This clearly is not the end of this conversation. This is the beginning of a series of conversations that I think we're all going to need to be having in the UC system, but wherever you are, because I know there are people who are attending the webinar from other smaller campuses around the country without the same kind of heft that we have in the UC to really try to move things if we decide to do so. I'll end where I began, which is that, to me, the political challenge is the one that seems like the insurmountable one, not the economic challenge, because the economic is, for me, only a species of the political. Again, mindful of the time, I want to acknowledge my staff who have been here helping us organize this webinar, Allison Marks, Andrew Pfeifroth, and Hannah Kang, whom I actually officially dismissed as of 4 minutes ago. So y'all should go home because it's a holiday weekend. And in the School of Social Sciences, we're doing traffic mitigation. So everyone gets to end work early. I suppose it's internet traffic mitigation. But Hannah, do you have a last word? I should also just thank you, Hannah, for co-organizing this, for having the idea to do this, for assembling this fantastic group of people, and for managing there in your home on Child Island.
Yeah, Bill knows about Child Island around here. No, I just thank you so much to all the panelists, and thank you to Bill's team and to the team at the Institute on Inequality and Democracy, Ananya Roy, Marisa Lemerond and Vanya Scalini for all of your help in making this possible. And just to reiterate, it is the beginning. We will stay in touch via email with all registered panelists with links to resources and ways that you can get involved in various organizing events that are taking place, or sorry, organizing efforts that are taking place, because it is just the beginning of developing the political will, and we got to do it. So, okay, thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you. Goodbye.